Hello, I'm going to describe how to put aspect lines in an in-Mundo AstroMap. I'm also going to explain later in this tutorial video how to put midpoint lines in an in-Mundo AstroMap. This is a very important topic. Why is it important? Because we use AstroMaps a lot. Many of us astrologers use AstroMaps. Many of us like to put aspect lines in the AstroMap. But there are problems and issues when you try to do it in Mundo. No problems and issues when you do it in Zodiac longitude, but when you do it in Mundo, there are questions about how to do it, whether you can really even do it. And I'm going to show you how it can be done and how it can be done correctly. So this is exciting. And I've got some new information here that at least I haven't seen presented before. Okay, so let's look at an AstroMap to see what I'm talking about. I've got the chart of Julia Roberts here, the actress, and let's look at a map. Let's look at an AstroMap. So I'm in the Series 2.0 software. I select an AstroMap, and let's just do the United States. And I'm going to do a basic map. The basic map is the original Jim Lewis map. So in the Sirius software, also the Kepler software, if you select a basic map, this Just Lines basic map, that's Jim Lewis style, original AstroCartography. It's Jim Lewis if you do it in Mundo. And right here I can select in Mundo. We want the normal or typical in Mundo. It tells me it's going to apply this to all of these Just Line style AstroMaps. Now I've got Jim Lewis. That's the first point I want to make. This is Jim Lewis. That means the planets are on the horizon and the meridian plane. You could say there are no aspects because the planets are just sitting on the horizon or meridian plane, which is what in Mundo means. So let's look at it. We see about a half a dozen lines for the United States. That's typical. When you do the a basic AstroMap, which is the style that, again, that Jim Lewis did, which shows planets on the horizon or meridian plane, you may get just one or two lines, you may get a dozen. This looks about typical. Here's Mars opposite the ascendant. But the ascendant in Mundo, some people would say you shouldn't call it the ascendant, you should just call it the east horizon. I'm going to go ahead and sometimes use the term ascendant for in Mundo, which is this, more properly probably should be called the east horizon. But I'll just call it the ascendant. Mars is opposite the ascendant. Which in Jim Lewis style maps and basic AstroMap means it's on the descendant, because we're only looking at objects on the horizon. So in a basic AstroMap, an opposition means it's on the opposite side of that plane. So opposite the east horizon is on the west horizon. We're going to find out that when you add aspects, this gets more complicated. Okay. It gets very interesting when you add trines and sextiles, and even real oppositions. So in the basic AstroMap, again, we're just looking at planets on the horizon and meridian plane. Now, if I do it in Zodiac longitude, what's the difference? Many of you are familiar with this. What happens when we do this in Zodiac longitude? The lines will move a little bit. So in Mundo, Saturn conjunct the midheaven goes through Duluth, Mars opposite the ascendant goes in here between Arizona and California and so on. I'm going to right-click, change this to Zodiac longitude, click OK, and now Saturn conjunct the midheaven, instead of going through Duluth, is further west going through Minneapolis, and Mars opposite the ascendant is now closer to Phoenix, Arizona. So the lines move a little bit. That's to review the basics of standard astrocartography. These are astrocartography maps, which in the Sirius and Kepler programs are called basic maps. So basic map, another term for this is standard, original Jim Lewis astrocartography. Would be a nice long way of explaining that. Now it gets interesting when you add aspects. More than the planet being right on the horizon plane of the meridian plane, fascinating things happen. I want to show this to you. Let's do it in Zodiac longitude first. So I've got Zodiac longitude. Well, this is the part that's not so fascinating and strange looking. It gets strange when I do it in Mundo, but I'm leading up to it. Let's take this one step at a time. Let's look at when we add aspect lines. Okay, I'll click OK. Well, it's pretty much what we expect. We just get more lines. Instead of half a dozen lines, we got dozens of lines. The midheaven lines are all vertical, and of course they're parallel because they're all vertical, parallel to each other. There's that Saturn conjunct. The midheaven in Zodiac longitude tells us up here. Zodiac longitude is what we selected, going through Minneapolis. There's the Mars opposite the ascendant, and now it also shows Sun trine the ascendant going through Phoenix. So if we relocate her chart, we will see that when we relocate to Phoenix, Arizona, Mars would be on the 7th cusp. Sun will be trine the ascendant because we're doing this in Zodiac longitude. So this is simple and straightforward. What gets interesting, and I'm going to show you next, is when we add aspect lines in Mundo instead of in Zodiac longitude. Let me tell you what we're going to see, and then I'll show it to you. We're going to see that the midheaven lines won't change much. Again, they're going to just move around a little bit, but they'll still be vertical. But the ascendant lines go crazy. And you may even think it's a bug or something, but it's not. When you do aspects to the ascendant and the descendant, or if you prefer, you can call that east horizon, west horizon, technically better terminology, it's different. It's way different. Let me show you how it's way different. I'm going to right-click. I've got major aspects selected, right? And I'm going to select in Mundo. In Mundo, normal or typical in Mundo. It gives me a little message. It's going to apply this to all my maps of these kind of maps. Now watch this. Way different. I'm going to click OK. Way different. What's so different? Again, as I said, the midheaven lines are not so different. They're still vertical, and they've just moved a little bit from where they were when we did it in longitude. Remember, it's a little bit, but interpretation-wise, it could be very significant, because now, in Mundo, that Saturn comes from the midheaven, goes through Duluth instead of Minneapolis. So where is Julie Roberts going to have Saturn midheaven the strongest? Is it Duluth or is it Minneapolis? Will depend on whether you do it in Mundo or whether you do it in Zodiac longitude. But that's not as extreme a difference as what we see going on with the ascendant. Look at the ascendant lines. Instead of being all parallel, they're crisscrossing all over the place. So the conclusion is this, very important point. When you do aspect lines in Mundo, they crisscross all over the place, and they're just very different from doing it in Zodiac longitude. Midheaven's not so different, but the ascendant is. Now that intuitively may not make sense to you. Maybe you're wondering, why is it so different when I do the ascendant? I'm going to explain those technicalities, and I'm going to explain them in some detail in a separate video, because I don't want to bore half of you to death with a lot of technical details on astronomy and so on. But for now, just take my word for it. When you do aspect lines in Mundo to the ascendant and descendant, they're very different. They crisscross all over the place. And there's another difference. Look at these labels down here. Do you see anything different? Instead of all being yellow, some of them have green labels. What does that mean? For example, Sun sextile in green connected to a yellow line going through El Paso, Texas, Durango, Colorado, etc. What does the green versus yellow mean? It means this. Yellow is to the ascendant, or more properly we would say east horizon, and green is to the descendant, or west horizon. This is the big deal in when you do in Mundo. The descendant is not opposite the ascendant. Okay, you got it? It doesn't. This may not sound intuitively seem to make sense, but the west horizon is not opposite the east horizon when you do it in Mundo. And when I tell you that, you may think, David, you're crazy. I can go out and see that the west horizon is opposite the east horizon. It's one horizon. How could it not be It's opposite. It's just one big horizon plane. Well, the reason it's not opposite is because of the way that the distances are calculated, which I will explain later on, and especially in a separate video. How these angles are calculated in Mundo, it ends up not being opposite. So right now, that may not sound intuitively obvious, but it's true. You can just take my word for it for now. That final conclusion is, when you do an astromap in zodiac longitude, you basically are taking aspects to two things. Let's look at it. I'll right-click, go back to zodiac longitude. We have aspects to two things. We have aspects to the midheaven, and we have aspects to the ascendant. Where are our aspects to the descendant? Well, Mercury's trying the ascendant, going through almost right through Denver, Colorado, means that it's sextile the descendant. We all know that as astrologers. The planet trying the ascendant is sextile the descendant. Same thing up here. If I take Saturn conjunct the midheaven, means it's opposition the icy. So if you're trying to one angle, you're sextile to the other. Mercury trine midheaven is sextile the IC. So you only really need to refer to the MC, because you know if it's a trine to the MC, it's sextile to the IC. That's how it works in zodiac longitude. You have two things, the midheaven and the ascendant. In Mundo, you have three things instead of two. That's the difference. Instead of two, you have three things. You still have the midheaven, you still have the ascendant, but now you have a descendant, which is not opposite the ascendant. So if I right-click, I go to in Mundo, click OK. We have three things. We have the red letters with white background labels connected to the red lines are midheaven. We have yellow lines connected to yellow labels is ascendant, and we have yellow lines connected to green labels are to the descendant. So you have three things instead of two, because when you do in Mundo, the ascendant is not opposite the ascendant. That's the first major point I want to make. And so let's review. I'm going to review very, very quickly and then move on to the next concept. Number one, the original astrocartography map developed by Jim Lewis shows only planets on the horizon plane and meridian plane. And I'm calling this AstroMap the basic AstroMap. Number two, if you compare a basic AstroMap, in other words, the original Jim Lewis style astrocartography map, the lines just move very slightly when you compare zodiac longitude and in Mundo to each other. Number three, terminology can get confusing here, and I will use the term ascendant to refer to the east horizon when we're doing in Mundo, and I'll sometimes use the word descendant to mean the west horizon. I just think it's convenient because we can use the same terminology, ascendant and descendant, in Mundo. And in a basic astromap, a planet opposite the ascendant is conjunct the descendant. So the terminology changes depending on whether you're talking about a Jim Lewis style astrocartography map, the original one, where there are no aspects. There are no aspects. You're just looking at the planet on the meridian plane. So I'll show this to you real quickly just to make this sure that this is completely clear. If I do a basic astromap and I do it in Mundo and I click OK, I'm doing Jim Lewis style. There are no aspects. So when it says Mars is opposite the ascendant, that's the same as saying conjunct the descendant. But when I add aspect lines, then an opposition has a separate meaning. It's a separate aspect to the horizon plane. So when I do this with aspects, now we have an ascendant and a descendant that are different from each other. And that Mars, there's so many lines now it gets confusing, but that Mars opposite the ascendant is now considered to be a conjunction to the descendant, and it's put in green as a conjunction descendant. All right, so this may sound confusing, but it's very simple. what we're saying is that the ascendant and descendant are not opposite to each other when you add aspect lines. Okay, more key points. Is it possible to also have in Mundo aspects? If we can, how do we do it? The answer is yes, and now this is the part I didn't explain, but just a little note about how this is done. When you measure aspects, the distance of when you measure the distance of planets to the meridian plane in Mundo, in the Middle Ages they used something called right ascension. And to measure distance from the horizon plane, either the east horizon or west horizon, they use something called diurnal and nocturnal semi-arcs. If you've never heard these terms before, then it's only because you're a modern astrologer in the 21st century. If it was the Middle Ages, you'd probably have heard of these things. Diurnal and nocturnal semi-arcs are what were used in the Middle Ages to measure the angle of a planet to the horizon plane. And so there's a long tradition to this way of doing in Mundo. In Mundo has been used for many hundreds of years. And the in Mundo AstroMap is applying an ancient idea to a modern technology of having astromaps. So in Mundo is nothing new. It's been around for many hundreds of years. It was used in the Middle Ages it was used in forecasting methods like primary directions. And it's also based on an idea in astronomy that makes sense. If you understand the astronomy behind this, using measurements in right ascension to the meridian plane and using nocturnal and diurnal semi-arcs makes sense. So it makes sense intuitively and logically, and there's a strong tradition to it. So we clearly have a way to do in Mundo aspects, and that's how we do it. We do diurnal and nocturnal semi-arcs to the horizon plane, and we measure in right ascension to midheaven. And when we use diurnal and nocturnal semi-arcs to the horizon plane, the east horizon and west horizon are not opposite to each other. So, point here, when we add aspects, such as oppositions, trines, sextiles, and squares to an astromap, an opposition to the ascendant is not the same as conjunct the descendant when you put in the aspects. And a trine to the ascendant is not sextile to the descendant when you have in Mundo aspects. Okay. Anyway, all of this is taken care of for you, so you don't really have to think about it. When you're, say, in the Sirius software, for example, you just have it. You select aspects, and the green labels appear to the descendant. If I right-click and I remove aspects, and I just do the basic map, the Jim Lewis style map, then all my labels to the ascendant will be yellow. There won't be any green ones because I'm not using aspects. I'm just doing the Jim Lewis style, putting things on the horizon and on the meridian plane. Okay, and just to review, we've made this clear. When we do an in Mundo astromap, the lines are not parallel, and some of the labels are green. The green labels are the aspects of the descendant. And in an in Mundo astromap, there are 3, not 2 kinds of aspects. We have aspects to midheaven, ascendant, and descendant. Okay, that's it. Now, so you can put aspect lines in your in Mundo astromap. Well, that's cool. You can do it. There's a history behind doing it that's hundreds of years old. It makes sense astronomically. Great. Does it work? Can I start putting aspect lines in my astromaps? And will they make sense? Well, I've only started looking at this very recently because this problem of how to calculate in Mundo aspect lines, I started working on it decades ago, came back to it. It's only very recently that I worked this out in detail and tested it very carefully to make sure the calculations are right, refine everything, make it easier to select, and start working with it. And it appears to work. This is very exciting that there is a clear way to do it. We have the software working now to produce it. I'll show you an example of what I mean by working. I'll just show you one example. And this is a funny example. I'm going to close this window for a second. It's my own chart. And what's funny about this, curious about it, interesting, is that I wrote a book called Astrolocality Magic, where I say that you can take novile aspects, novile, binovile, quadnovile, and also trines and sextiles, 40 degrees, 80 degrees of Moon and Venus, geolocated ascendant midheaven, and those are places where you're comfortable. I did it using zodiac longitude. I'll show you what I looked at. I'll take my chart, I'll do an AstroMap, and I'll show you what I had originally looked at. It works better in Mundo. That's what's incredible, is that I developed the theory based on longitude, and done in Mundo, it even works better. And I'm going to zoom into where I live, which is in North Florida, a town called Gainesville, Florida, if I can type properly, Gainesville, Florida. And I'm going to zoom in. This is a fun thing to do. Zoom into the place where you live, and then do an extremely detailed map. It'll show all the minor aspects and midpoints, like everything that's going on where you live. And I'm going to do it, I'll do it in zodiac longitude first. This is what my original observation was, interviewing hundreds of people, and then doing like this little research study after that, confirmed that people often had like this Venus 140 degrees from the midheaven, means 40 degrees from the 4th house cusp going east of Gainesville. Not extremely close, just barely close enough to be relevant. Now what happens when we do this in Mundo, and aspect lines, especially to the ascendant, are completely different? A Venus 40 degrees, which is the novile, goes right almost through my house. I mean, it's amazing. So I have this theory that these particular angles are important, and I never knew until very recently that when I do it in Mundo, it works out precisely, suggesting that in Mundo is confirming a theory. So I'll change this to in Mundo, click OK, and we will see that the Venus 40 degrees, here it is, Venus 40 degrees, which is the novile, coming up here on the west side of Gainesville. Guess which side of Gainesville I live on? Right close to that, on the west side of Gainesville. So anyway, it's fun to work with. Whether you think minor aspects might be important or not, it's fun to look at these things and see what kind of aspects you have where you live or where you work or places you love. Doing it in Mundo, and it's I'm just giving you one example of things you can look at. You might be more interested in just looking at trines and squares and so on in Mundo and see if it makes sense. Okay, so I'm not going to give lots of examples. It'll take forever, but just one fun example of looking at aspects in Mundo. And again, the aspects to the ascendant and descendant are very different from zodiac longitude, so it's fun to see what information is there and see if it makes sense. Now, last topic for this tutorial video is midpoints, and this is really exciting. This seems to really work. Can you do in Mundo midpoints? You can. We don't have an ancient tradition for this because there isn't very much literature from Middle Ages or Hellenistic astrology or Vedic astrology on midpoints, almost none. So we need to think about how could we do midpoints in Mundo. I did some thinking about it and analyzing it, and I noticed something very fascinating. I did not anticipate that I would discover, but I just was playing around with the astronomy of it, and I found something interesting. And then I applied it to some charts, and it seems to work. So this is pretty exciting. Okay. The question is, can we do in Mundo midpoints? Can we do it? Okay, so here's a little picture of the horizon. So when you're looking out on the ocean, that horizon is virtually identical to the astronomical horizon. Right here I have in kind of a white sort of color the astronomical horizon. And over here I made a little kind of asterisk thing in white representing a star. Suppose there's a star here. Suppose there's a planet there. Suppose Venus is there or something. And over here, put a little star. Imagine Jupiter's there. You wouldn't be able to see it because it'd be below the horizon. But suppose Jupiter's in that direction. And then I just thought, well, what if we just take the midpoint? The actual, what I call direct distance midpoint. You may say, well, what other midpoint is there? Well, in astrology, we often project onto these other great circles and do all these things. But I just analyzed a few possibilities. And one possibility would be, we'll take the direct distance midpoint. Technically, we call it find the midpoint in its own great circle. We create what's called a great circle between the two planets. This would be one planet, say Venus. Say this is Jupiter. And then right here would be the midpoint. Well, I thought about this and I found something quite fascinating, which is that this direct distance midpoint results in the star and the two, well, let's just call them planets, because we're thinking about planets, right? Venus and Jupiter would have the same distance from the horizon plane. I just figured this out, just mathematically, analytically. I determined that it's a fact that this what's called the altitude, the distance from the horizon, is the same. So you could say you want to find when two stars have the same altitude, one above the horizon and one below, is exactly the same thing as saying I want the direct distance midpoint. It's two ways of saying the same thing. I think it's really cool when two intuitively appealing ideas, visually appealing ideas, say the same thing. It's appealing to me to know when a planet would have the same distance above the horizon as below the horizon, and then I find out that that's exactly the same thing as the direct distance midpoint being on the horizon. And also, the measurement along the horizon, called azimuth, from this midpoint to one planet is the same as this distance. So I put these little black arrows, meaning the distance from this midpoint to the what we call the azimuth of the planet to this one. These lines are the same. What you create are two triangles that are identical. They're called congruent triangles in geometry. These are congruent spherical triangles where the altitudes are the same, the distance from the object and the azimuth from the midpoint is the same. These two, by definition, these distances are the same. And I use what's called spherical trigonometry to show to myself the same. Anyway, it's a very cool thing, this direct midpoint. What's really cool about it is that in looking at it in charts, it seems to really work. And I'm going to show you an example of that. And by the way, for those of you who are really techies, what you can use here are called Napier's rules for spherical right triangles. And here are some of the formulas of Napier's rules for right spherical triangles, where in this diagram we have the capital letters are the angles, the small letters like A are the sides. It's a little hard to tell, but this is a small c, this is a capital C. Anyway, and using that, you can apply these and mathematically prove that those are congruent triangles. Anyway, we're astrologers. We don't want to be bothered with all those numbers, but I just thought I'd let you know. What's really relevant to us as astrologers is that we can come up with an idea of how to get midpoints to the ascendant. If you do them to the meridian axis, you'll also get congruent triangles. And in the Series 2.0 software, I also added an option to calculate the midpoints to the midheaven using equal distances in right ascension, just because some people may find that might be intuitively more appealing. I've experimented with these on many dozens of people, and the direct distance midpoints do seem to really work, and I will show you an example of that. So here I mentioned that we have two ways in the series software to calculate in Mundo midpoints, only one way to do it to the ascendant, and I think it's the direct distance, which is the way it's done to the ascendant, is personally the one that's looking much more promising to me. And I'll show you an example of it. let's look at where Ben Affleck, another actor, has a home. You know, these homes are mansions. He has a really expensive, elaborate home outside Los Angeles in a town called Pacific Palisades. And Julia Roberts also has a big, beautiful home outside Los Angeles in Malibu, both on the coast Los Angeles. Both of them, and I'll show it to you in a second, have the Venus-Jupiter midpoint opposite the midheaven. It means on the fourth house cusp, right where they have this huge, elaborate, beautiful home. They both have Venus-Jupiter opposite the midheaven. I think it's quite fascinating. So let's look at that. Let's close this, and let's pull up Julia Roberts, and let's do a map, an AstroMap for Malibu, California. I'm going to zoom all the way in. I don't need minor aspects right now. I just want to look at the midpoints to show you something interesting with a midpoint. And I want the midpoints in direct distance. I've got in Mundo selected and direct distance midpoints. I will click OK. And we will see that the Venus-Jupiter midpoint, there it is, Venus-Jupiter midpoint, slash means midpoint, midpoint of Venus-Jupiter, opposition to midheaven, means conjunct the fourth cusp, done in Mundo, just east of Malibu. So when she's traveling from Los Angeles to Malibu, back and forth from her acting she probably does in the Los Angeles area, she's going right through her Venus-Jupiter line, done in Mundo. Fascinating. Now, in her case, if I right-click and I do this in Zodiac longitude, it ends up almost identical. I just right-click, I change it to Zodiac longitude, and now the Venus-Jupiter line moves only a tiny bit. Now it's moved very slightly west, slightly closer to Mount, almost identical, made almost no difference, so we're not able to distinguish a direct distance Venus-Jupiter midpoint from the one that's not direct distance, which is, in other words, well, this is in Zodiac longitude, and also if I right-click and I do it in Mundo, not direct distance, and click OK, the Venus-Jupiter is still in the same spot. So no matter how I calculate, whether I do in Mundo direct distance, in Mundo right ascension, which is the option when you don't select it, or I do it in longitude, they all say the same thing. However, for Ben Affleck, it's totally different. So what I'm showing you here is that sometimes you'll get similar calculations using different methods, and sometimes you do not. Now I'll show you Ben Affleck, and we'll do an AstroMap for him for Pacific Palisades, where he has this beautiful home. I'm going to zoom in all the way. I'll show you something very interesting. We'll do an aspects with midpoints. We'll do it in Mundo, and I'm going to do it direct distance. And he will have the same exact midpoint that Julia Roberts has. Venus-Jupiter midpoint opposite the midheaven, going almost exactly right through Pacific Palisades. Same midpoint where he has all of this wealth and opulence that he's chosen to live in, right there. Attracting wealth and opulence and expressing it. Either one of these actors might have chosen a smaller home closer where they work, but they decided to do that right there and have the opportunity to do it and attract it and magnetize it into their lives and create that reality right on the Venus-Jupiter opposite the midheaven. Really extraordinary. Now, an interesting thing is that when I right-click and I still do in Mundo, but not direct distance, the Venus-Jupiter will disappear. It's gone. He does have a Mars-Uranus midpoint opposite the midheaven, going just west of Pacific Palisades. done in right ascension rather than direct distance. But the Venus-Jupiter moves. In the next video, for those of you who want to follow the technical details and get more into the technical details, I'll show you a little bit more about it, where his Venus-Jupiter midpoint is when done in right ascension rather than direct distance. But the point is, it's not here. So, this is just one example of how doing in Mundo midpoints using a direct distance calculation really seems to make sense. I've looked at many examples in my chart, friends and family chart, etc., charts, etc., and just, you know, it just makes sense. I can relate to it. Okay, so to go over our points here, what we found out is that a summary of what we learned. Let's just review what we learned. Take a deep breath and go over this. What we have learned is, regarding in Mundo aspects, what do we know about in Mundo aspects? Number one, there are aspects to the midheaven IC axis, to the east horizon and the west horizon in Mundo. Right? So just to go over all this. When you do in Mundo aspects, you have an aspect to the midheaven, to the ascendant, and the descendant. Or if you prefer, you could call it to the meridian plane, to the east horizon, and to the west horizon. The angles to the horizon plane and the meridian plane are calculated using methods that were developed in the Middle Ages. That's, you know, interesting. And they intuitively make sense. If you understand the astronomy behind it, I think you will agree that what they figured out way back in the Middle Ages makes sense. Doesn't mean it's right, but at least it makes sense. It intuitively makes sense. And from observation, you know, they use these in Mundo methods of calculating angles for primary directions and so on. And from observation, they do appear to work. It appears that these aspects may work. So as more astrologers work with them, we will see if they are useful. Perhaps even more controlled studies will be done to verify these things. And also midpoints, which is a more modern idea, but they appear to work, especially if in the Series 2.0 software, I believe, if you go ahead and check that option for direct distance to the midheaven, and then you get direct distance midpoints to both the ascendant and the midheaven. And my observations, they really do appear to work. And last thing I want to say is, just to give you a sense of the development here, it's taken many years to master the astrological concepts, the astronomical foundations, determine what the formulas are, debug the formulas, implement them in a graphic format. The debugging of this code, very time-consuming. So, in the last few weeks, so as of February 2nd, 2015, in the last month or so, I've been double-checking and triple-checking the calculations, refining it, making some improvements to the user interface, and as of right now, it's really elegant and beautifully done. We will bring this capability into the Kepler 8 software. We'll look at some of our other astro-mapping software as well to see how it's doing it and if it's doing it properly. But right now, as of today, the Series 2.0 software has a number of nice improvements and careful testing that it does all this definitely correctly. And I mentioned here, I will have another tutorial video that I'm going to make immediately after this one. I'll probably upload it on the same day on the technicalities of verifying, just in case you're curious and you say, you know, this is all great, but how do I know you really calculated this direct midpoint properly? I'm just taking it on faith that all of this is done properly. I'm going to make another video which I don't think is as important as this video because it's just to show you how to confirm that the calculations are correct. Last thing I want to mention is if I right-click here, if some of you have Series 2.0 and you're wondering about these colors, these are not the default colors. You may even notice things like there's a nice little border that we added around here. We added an option to place the map in a slightly different place within the window by default. Some of these options I've added in the last few weeks, and if you go to the Customize and Features of all AstroMaps, here's where you select a color set, and I'm using the light tan land. So I made it easier to select some color sets. We also have some new options for where the map is placed. I'm using what's called a center left selection, which places the map center vertically, but towards the left horizontally. So a nice place for the map to be. Other little things I'll just cancel out of this and cancel out of this. Went ahead and put the magnifying lenses here, which is faster than clicking here. So anyway, made a number of little improvements to this. We're always doing this. So if you have the Series 2.0 and you don't have all the features or it doesn't look quite the same, you can download and install the latest free update to give that to you. So quite frankly, I'm very excited about what we're doing with software, that not only are we going over and rigorously testing and refining the calculations, improving the look and feel constantly. We have these tutorial videos to explain what these ideas are, help you fully appreciate them, develop a community of people using the ideas, sharing their experiences, and even the technical information to verify all the details of how it's done. So we're creating a whole new world of information, calculation power, learning, experiencing, community to share these ideas. A whole new 21st century world of information that's available through these videos, through the software, and through the community of people using and helping us work with the software. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for being part of the Cosmic Patterns software family. God bless. Namaste.